Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Isabel Neville, the Forgotten Duchess of medieval England. The history books are full of rich stories about men and women in past societies. We can learn about the kings and queens who ruled the kingdom, as well as the lords and ladies who attended their courts. If we think about medieval England, specifically the latter part, then we are taken to the Wars of the Roses and the battles that were fought. We think of King Henry VI and Richard III, to just name a few, as well as the likes of Warwick Kingmaker and his daughter who became a queen. If we look close enough at the history, then we can see that that particular queen, Anne Neville, had a sister who also married into royalty. Isabel Neville is a woman mostly forgotten, and it is this royal duchess that we will be focusing on. Who was she, and what challenges did she come across in her life? Isabel Neville was born on the 5th of September 1451 within the walls of Warwick Castle. Her father was Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick, also known as the Kingmaker, and her mother was Anne de Beauchamp, the 16th Countess of Warwick in her own right. Isabel was the eldest of two, with her sister Anne being born a few years later. The sisters were brought up by a governess and received a high standard of education for women of the era. When Isabel was just 6 years of age, her father was appointed the position of Captain of Calais, and the family found themselves living in France. You see, Richard Neville was deeply involved in what would be known as the Wars of the Roses, and for this their lives would forever be affected. It wasn't until 1464 that the family returned to England, with a Yorkist king, Edward IV, on the throne. The next couple of years saw Isabel and Anne living at Middleham Castle, and it's even thought that the pair would have attended some events at court. It's believed that for the time period, the sisters received a somewhat traditional upbringing, and that they were even present at the christening of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville's child, Elizabeth of York, in 1466. On the 12th of July 1469, to the dismay of the king, Isabel married George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence. George was the younger brother of the king, Edward. The wedding was undoubtedly also attended by the bride's parents and possibly even the groom's mother, Cecily. This meant that Isabel was now a royal duchess, but her father and her new husband planned to remove King Edward from the throne. But it all went belly up. Sadly and tragically, Isabel had fallen pregnant shortly after the wedding, and it was when they fled to Calais that things took a dark turn. You see, whilst on the ship, Isabel had gone into labour, and once they arrived they were denied entry into harbour. This resulted in a tragic and upsetting incident. Isabel, with only the help of her mother, was denied a midwife, and her child was stillborn. Multiple sources differ on what the sex of the child was, but it is agreed that the child was either buried at sea or taken ashore. They were finally able to disembark at Normandy on the 1st of May. The Duke of Clarence managed to reconcile with the king, and Isabel took her place at court as the second Lady of the land. Even though Isabel and George made amends, her father was less than ready to bow his head. He sided with Queen Margaret, the wife of Henry VI, the king who had been deposed by King Edward. You see, she and her son, Edward of Westminster, the Prince of Wales, were in France waiting for their chance. Isabel's sister, Anne, had been duly betrothed to Edward on July 25, 1470, and were married sometime before the December. After this, the invading forces returned to England in the April, but Isabel and Anne's father found himself being killed in battle the same month, and their mother fled to sanctuary. Anne then also found herself a widow, because when she was just 14 years of age, her husband Edward was also killed in battle. Anne Neville was eventually released into the custody of Isabel and George, but this was not a happy arrangement. You see, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, brother to George, was actually seeking the hand of Anne. Richard had met Anne when they were both resided at Middleham Castle as children. George, the Duke of Clarence, was not having any of it. The courtship between Anne and Richard may have been all romance, or it could have been calculated, but that is something we shall never know. Anne had found herself a prisoner of Edward IV, and she was taken to London and placed into the house of her sister and brother-in-law. It was here that Anne was kept for safekeeping at their home in Cold Harbour, with the intention of finding her a husband, but Anne was betrayed by her own sister. Isabel and her husband had planned to rob Anne of her half of their mother's inheritance, and then place Anne into a nunnery. She was even made to dress as a servant and made to work in their kitchens. Isabel had intended to hide her away so that Richard could not find her or rescue her. After around 10 months of imprisonment, on the 16th of February 1472, Anne finally managed to escape, and she fled into sanctuary at the London Collegiate Church of St Martin le Grand. This is where she remained until July, waiting for dispensation to arrive. With an eye to the main chance, Richard saved Anne's portion of her inheritance, bargained for the release of her mother from the convent where the king was keeping her in confinement, and finally wed Anne. Although the date is uncertain, or even the legality of the marriage, for there was no papal dispensation, a legal necessity because of their close family relationship. At the time of the marriage, Anne was 15 and Richard was 18, and they made their home at Middleham Castle, and their only son Edward is thought to have been born in around 1474. Interestingly, the Duke of Clarence was granted Isabel's portion of the Warwick inheritance. This was a reward for defecting back to King Edward. Isabel and George would have preferred Anne to have not remarried, for then they could have had the whole sum of inheritance, but, as I previously spoke about, Richard was able to protect Anne's portion. Another interesting thing is that although she was not actually dead, Anne de Beauchamp, mother of the two sisters, was declared legally dead in order to divide the inheritance. She was in fact still in sanctuary. Isabel and George had 2 children that lived into adulthood. Their second child to be born was a daughter called Margaret, and she was born on the 14th of August 1473. Their third child was a son named Edward, and he was born on the 25th of February 1476. Isabel and George did have a 4th child, a son called Richard, and he was born on the 6th of October 1476, but tragically little Richard died aged 3 months, and Isabel herself would not see the new year. At the time of Isabel's death, George was looking for someone to blame. He had lost his son and his wife within a couple of weeks of each other. Isabel had died on the 22nd of December 1476, and Richard died on the 1st of January 1477, just 2.5 months after giving birth. With his wife now dead, George looked at those closest to her to point the finger of blame. The following April, George was adamant that her death was the outcome of murder, and that the person responsible was one of her ladies-in-waiting, Anne Corrette Twinihoe. George took the matter even further and committed an act of notorious judicial murder. Anne Corrette was suspected of poisoning Isabel by giving her a venomous drink of ale mixed with poison. In a single day, Anne Corrette was tried, indicted, and hanged. It wasn't until her grandson, Roger, submitted a petition to King Edward IV in 1478 that Anne Corrette was given a pardon, although this would not have helped her, as she was still very much dead. Modern-day historians believe that Isabel's death could have been down to 2 things, and murder by poison does not even enter the playing field. The first cause was consumption, otherwise known as tuberculosis, and the second, childbed fever. Childbed fever, also known as any bacterial infection that enters a woman's reproductive tract following either childbirth or miscarriage. Sadly, this type of fever was caused by poor hygiene in this era, and although today we see cases of this in forms of things like sepsis within the uterus and postpartum metriitis or endometriitis, we do have medication to turn these from deadly to treatable. But in the case of Isabel Neville, and looking at Tudor women Jane Seymour and Catherine Parr, medical knowledge was not advanced enough to have saved them, nor was the believed need to keep a high level of hygiene for both the mother and those attending to her. After Isabel's death, she was buried behind the high altar at Tewkesbury Abbey, and not much later she was joined by her husband after his execution for treason. In a sad twist of fate, their 2 surviving children, later Margaret Pole The 8th Countess of Salisbury and Edward Plantagenet, the 17th Earl of Warwick, were executed within the reign of King Henry VIII. They both had a claim to the throne, for they both had Plantagenet blood running through their veins, yet their reasons for execution were noted as something else. Being a medieval woman was no easy task, no matter your standing, but Isabel Neville clearly had a roller coaster of a life. She is overshadowed by her sister in the history books, but she was a Duchess nonetheless. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.